Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 58. One of the cognitive challenges, and something just by the nature of being an artist of any kind, to really challenge yourself to do is accept that we enjoy feeling negative feelings, and that's really essential to the rainbow circle. I have a rainbow circle behind me now. That's really essential to the rainbow circle. The recognition that the value in a piece of art is the stimulation of empathetic visceral experiences, disregarding the dualistic distinction between good and bad. So, recognition that our desire is for the intensity of negative feelings or the intensity of positive feelings, but we have this rationalization that tends to convince us that bad feelings are bad and good feelings are good. Just to name negative feelings. And arguably, and it's especially significant with sadness. Arguably, something like sadness, it's hard to just call that bad or just call it negative necessarily. It's really important part of stimulation of emotional experiences and empathy and all that kind of stuff. But do we really have good, clear, effective, neutral language to describe what we normally would call negative feelings, like sadness? Very dualistic sort of language that we have with that kind of thing. But one of the really fascinating negative feelings that comes up in really, really extra complicated ways is anger and hate. This sort of connects with what I've been talking about lately. But this is part of what's really fascinating about and I had a whole video about this, about the language of professional wrestling and the idea of heat being so central. And they really recognize that heat is a commodity. It's something that you aim for, and the more heat you actually get, the more effective a narrative is. Very few other art forms actually make this central. But it is fascinating to look at. There are plenty of public figures who function as heels do in wrestling, who exist to get heat. I don't know that in any other art form, if those public figures are necessarily doing it for an artistic end. So, for example, trolls, there's more of a harmful manifestation of the public figure heel aiming just for heat and nothing else. So, is there really an artist who aims for heat from a crowd and does heel work for a crowd for an artistic end? Andy Kaufman being one of the few exceptions. Andy Kaufman had great admiration for wrestling, for example. One of the fascinating types of videos, I say the word fascinating a lot, but it is fascinating. One of the fascinating types of videos that I've been indulging is tea videos. I'm not cool enough to pull off contemporary terminology. That tends to be what they're called. And so one of the favorites of tea videos is Onision. And Onision's an interesting one to look at because he did write a couple of novels. But apparently Onision is a legitimately terrible person. So, you can look at somebody like Ric Flair, who's doing just amazing heel work, but he seems like a decent guy, or just any sort of just great heel. They seem like decent guys, and they're, Ric Flair's very, very well respected by the community, whereas Onision seems like just a genuinely horrible person. So you can look at a lot of what he does as heel work, and that he's purposefully trying to elicit negative feelings from his audience. And so you can take a look at how they respond to his artistic output. There are a lot of reviews of his novels, and so to take those reviews and sort of break them apart and say, and they're reviews of his novels from people who hate him, and there's a lot of reasons to hate him. I'm no expert. I can't really go into all those details necessarily, but there are a lot of really legitimate reasons that he's a legitimately terrible person. But they'll go into, hours of detail just about all the bad things in his books. So to take that and break it apart and see, are these genuine problems with the novel? And a lot of them will be, the title will be, Onision wrote the worst novel ever, or whatever. But to break those apart and say, is that particular point a genuine flaw in the book? Is that point just a post-rationalization? And post-rationalizations can be based on lots of different things, but, if you're reading a book and you just viscerally, irrationally dislike it, you'll come up with an explanation for why you dislike it, and that may or may not be accurate, but those oftentimes settle into false universals. So a lot of the TV videos about his novel would be things like, that's unrealistic, that's not something that would happen in the real world. That's an entirely irrelevant critique. I'm not saying they're good or bad novels. I haven't read them. I have no idea. If they seem like, I personally would really dislike them. I mean, that certainly seems like valid. But when you hear a critique like Onision's book is bad because it's unrealistic, is realism really the actual issue? Or they'll say, this is bad because it's weird. Is weirdness really a bad? I hope that's not a universal bad. Or it's bad because it's, a common sort of criticism is the Mary Sueing a character. It's bad because this is a Mary Sue. And, things like, using Mary Sue's as a universal criticism is really ultimately a post-rationalization, because you can, there are plenty of perfectly fine stories that use Mary Sue's. Look at The Great Gatsby. Nick Carraway's Mary Sue. I don't like The Great Gatsby, but a lot of people do. Is Nick Carraway any different than a Mary Sue? Is every single Ernest Hemingway character any different from a Mary Sue? I don't like Ernest Hemingway either, but that's my personal opinion. I'm separating my personal opinion and my revulsion at Ernest Hemingway. I mean, an interesting nickname for him. Ernest Hemingway. My revulsion at Ernest Hemingway as a human being. I'm an animal lover, so the fact that Ernest Hemingway murdered so many animals is repulsive. Can I take that and separate it from his actual work? I also don't like his work. So that's an interesting cognitive challenge with somebody like Onision. And it seems like there's plenty to criticize about his books, from what I can tell secondhand. I'm not going to buy the books or read the books. I don't want to support him in any way. But, it seems like, there's plenty that you can criticize, but I don't know that weirdness is anything that you can identify as a legitimate problem in a novel. Hopefully not, at least. And then Onision will reply to these videos and say, this person obviously is obsessed with me because she, there's a bunch of these videos. This person's obviously obsessed with me because she spends an hour, fixated on my book. And that's an obvious fallacious retort to somebody criticizing your book, but it really identifies a lot of the power of hatred to make us care about something. So the idea that that hatred of someone is the polar opposite of love of someone, it can be really appealing to express in-depth hatred of someone without necessarily approving of anything about them, without necessarily saying, that's not a proof that Onision's a decent person, just because, people are fixated on, they're sort of tied to how much they really hate him. But it's a visceral stimulation to see somebody who's easy to hate and just pour your hate on them. So to really fairly assess something like Onision hate videos and how effectively they really reflect on just what sort of universals we can take from critiques of his novels. It would be effective to look at someone who's a good novelist, and I can't do that with Hemingway just personally. I could recognize how others could view his work as positive, despite some of the repulsiveness of his character. But hypothetically, what if you took somebody like Jonathan Franzen, and Jonathan Franzen, whether on purpose or not, does heel work. Lots and lots of people hate him on a personal level for a lot of his arguments and positions and what have you. And I read the corrections, and it was okay. I can't say it's a universally amazing book that I could point out. Here's a masterpiece. The corrections versus Onision's books, which are presumably not great. And that just hypothetically, that would be an interesting direct comparison. If I really did truly love the corrections, I didn't try to read any of his other books because I thought, the corrections is okay. I started writing a story called Freedom by Jonathan Franzen was the title of the story. And nobody's ever asked me about that title. It's not, I've never read Freedom by Jonathan Franzen. He had an article where he said, there should be more social novels. I didn't agree with his article. I mean, if his conclusion is that there are not enough social novels, there needs to be more, that's fine. That's a personal opinion. If he says that social novels are better than, I guess, non-social novels, just more purely aesthetic novels, I guess, it would be the opposite. I would disagree with that, but that's just his opinion. And then Freedom came out after that, and I said, yeah, seems like obviously what he's trying to do there. But I didn't read it. It seemed really boring, but that's just my personal opinion. But just hypothetically, you could take, what if you took the entirety of Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, and if you liked it, I guess, and said, here is all, put that side by side with an Onision novel. Here are two characters, public figures, who are abrasive and elicit a lot of hatred. Could I apply the same criticism I do of Onision to Jonathan Franzen? Is the same flaw in an Onision novel the same flaw in a Jonathan Franzen novel? Is realism the issue? Is weirdness the issue? But it's something hypothetically you could do. I'm not going to do that. I have no interest in actually doing that, but it is hypothetically an interesting type of analysis that you can do of heels, what you might call heels, and the books they write, and the sort of criticism that comes from that, based on how much, and I'm sure Jonathan Franzen has a lot of legitimate fans, but how much does the critic hate Jonathan Franzen for his personality, and how much does that really reflect on the book? Can we separate that hatred from the the actual assessment of the book? And that's sort of what I was talking about with Fight Club too. I mean, Fight Club has elicited a lot of people, a lot of fans, a lot of fans who see Tyler Durden as a role model, and that's a big part of Maggie Mayfish's deep dive into Fight Club. Does recognition of the effect that it's had affect our reading of it? Can we really read it objectively and separate it from the sorts of people who treat Tyler Durden as a role model? Is that a legitimate thing that we can separate from our assessment of Fight Club as a book or a movie or what have you? But I think an interesting example, somebody who's absolutely intentionally doing heel work, and I could say artistically has created masterpieces, is Kanye West. And I'm not a music expert. I have no position to talk about music, certainly not hip-hop music. I just a distant fan. And I appreciate just the beauty and the value of his music. And there are all kinds of different breakdowns of just the layering of samples, the lyric complexity of his lyrics, the lyric complexity of his lyrics. Yes, I know that's redundant. His lyric complexity, that would work better. The layering of the music that he creates, the complexity of the interaction of all of the different samples, how one sample layers on top of another sample that speaks to each other. All of that's just, it's beautiful. Not a music expert, can't speak authoritatively on music, but he's done plenty of masterpieces, I could say. Even, if you look at something like Runaway, that's gorgeous song. Video, the mini movie in the video, it's beautiful video. But he's absolutely a heel, and he's doing just magnificent heel work. How genuine that is part of just the genius of heel work, and it's just classic kayfabe. If you look at kayfabe, just meaning old Carney slang for fake, it's classic kayfabe work, crowd work, and he makes it really difficult to tell. Is he genuinely believing these crazy things that he says, or is he working the crowd? And so, and that's part of the brilliance of Runaway. Also, 3 Cheers for the douchebag. He's, it seems like he's very consciously aware on that level that that's part of the persona, and he's creating this intensely emotional song that elicits all these, intense feelings, but also layering on top of that, integrating his heel persona in the song. He does it in a lot of his songs, but that's definitely an example of where that's really central to the song. His heel persona is definitely central to the song itself. And so, I'm full disclosure, huge fan of Taylor Swift as well, who does a lot of that sort of work, in wrestling terms, that how much of what she does is a work and how much of what she does is legitimate and genuine. But his rushing the stage with Taylor Swift, essentially what he was doing was, he was a heel, he needed a face, a baby face, a good guy. So he's creating that scenario where he was the heel. Absolutely, he was the heel in that scenario, and Taylor Swift was the face. But it's layered further because I think one of the ways you could look at that heel face dynamic and understand a lot about the present world is to look at the Bret Hart Stone Cold Steve Austin rivalry, where the Bizarro world that just added a whole layer of complexity to heel work, because Bret Hart was a heel in the U.S. but facing everywhere else in the world. Stone Cold was a face, acted as a heel, but was a face in the U.S., but a heel just in Canada and other places. And if you look at just all the different moments in that rivalry where they acted the same in the U.S. and Canada, but what they were saying got polar opposite responses. So you can look at, like, on the one hand, rushing this stage while Taylor Swift is getting an award, it's heel work. It's definitely heel work, but it created that same sort of Bret Hart Stone Cold dynamic where it split the crowd and elicited intense passion. If you were a big fan of Kanye, he's still doing. I mean, it's sort of like Stone Cold. Stone Cold was doing heel work even when people were cheering him. If you were behind Kanye anyway, that just ramped up your support of him. if you were against Kanye anyway, that just ramped up your, the response that you had to him. And so, if that's just a public persona, and that's it, and all if his art is just him eliciting heat from the audience, that would be one thing. But it's also layered into a lot of his music, like Runaway, and that very, arguably very purposefully enhances the complexity of the emotional response to a song like Runaway. If he's a douchebag and in part of his public persona, and then part of this where the music is, very intense and sad and, layered and all this sort of stuff. If the lyric is three cheers for the douchebag, and the video has, all of these really intense, striking images, the heel persona in that case enhances the complexity of the enjoyment of the actual song, in that it's not just a sad song. It's a sad song and a song that makes you angry and a song that makes you, feel all of these really conflicting feelings simultaneously. So that is a case where, yeah, it absolutely has a heel persona, a public heel persona, but he's shaping it so that there's this feedback loop between, the music and his public persona. But I'm in Augusta right now, which is the home of James Brown, and there's a really interesting complicated family tree. I can say the word complicated a lot too. Complicated family tree in the interaction between hip hop and wrestling, because Augusta is also the home of Hulk Hogan, the birthplace, I should say, not the home anymore, but the birthplace of James Brown and Hulk Hogan. And Gorgeous George was just a major heel, very, very influential heel, who, among many, many other people he influenced, Ric Flair was one, but also Muhammad Ali and James Brown, because what Gorgeous George would do, he would play the crowd like an orchestra. He would get heat. He would play the crowd like an orchestra. And so if you look at Muhammad Ali's persona, what he's doing is heel work. And I'm not saying at all that Gorgeous George was the only place that influenced this. There's lots of influences on Muhammad Ali's persona, but one of many, many influences was Gorgeous George's ability to play the crowd like an orchestra, just to get all of these, all this massive heat from the crowd. And he had so many techniques, just the way he would delay the match and the way he would strut around and preen and, all that kind of stuff. The crowd he just drove the crowd crazy. And Gorgeous George is, very, very well respected now. I mean, that's just the nature of heel work. If somebody's really good at being a heel, you get negative response in the moment, but we can recognize the artistry after the fact. And James Brown didn't. The influence wasn't necessarily the heel work, but it was, a lot of the self-aggrandizement. A lot of that is really similar to Gorgeous George. Again, not the only influence that James Brown had in that, but it was, he was just a big fan of Gorgeous George. And so, James, early in the influence of hip-hop, you had Muhammad Ali and James Brown were pretty significant influences on the early development of hip-hop, and as a contemporary outcropping of a lot of that sort of concept of self-aggrandizement, and playing the crowd's emotions like an orchestra, eliciting heat, working the crowd, all that sort of stuff. The outcropping is of the evolution of the development of that variety of crowd work. You have Kanye as arguably one of the most prominent contemporary examples of that. But I think it's wrestling is one of the only places where that really is the central drive of so much of the narrative is how effectively the heels can work the crowd and elicit heat. And that's certainly, a part of hip hop. It's, really central with Kanye, but it's that sort of consciousness of crowd work is really central to it. And a lot of that has to do with just the nature of improvisational live performance. Not all hip hop, of course, is improvisational, but a lot of it is rooted in improvisational live crowd work and stuff like that, live performance. So it's kind of hard to translate that directly to fiction, but it would be an interesting thought experiment to take, take Onision's fiction. With the criticism, take Jonathan Franzen's fiction with his criticism, and take Kanye's music and his criticism, and just sort of place them side by side and see, compare that. That's a massive critical study, possibly. I'm not saying I'm actually going to do that, but that would be really fascinating, massive critical study. I'm sure Onision would probably love that and misinterpret the intention of that to say, Onision's really important. He's interested in being important more so than being loved, but that would be part of the hesitancy. I would actually have to read Onision's novels then, and I really don't want to. And, I'm sure Kanye wouldn't even notice, but if Kanye knew, he would have probably more of an artistic perspective on it and recognize partly it is an appreciation of his self-aggrandizing public persona, and part of it is an appreciation of his artistry. I'm not sure how Jonathan Franzen would respond to it. It might be interesting to see how he responds to it. Oh, by the way, Jonathan Franzen, I'm going to compare your novels to Kanye West's music and Onision's novels. But anyway, so that sort of thing is just to get a really, that goes back to what I was talking about with the Mogon, where if you come up with a criticism of somebody's work, or, praise or criticism, and you said, well, this is bad because it's unrealistic, can you take that criticism, and if you take a look at another work, would that still be the first thing? Would lack of realism still legitimately be the criticism that you apply to it? Clearly not. Or weirdness. If you said Onision's books are bad because they're weird, if you took that and you applied it to Kanye or somebody like that, and you said Kanye's music is bad because it's weird, well, no, that's clearly not a legitimate criticism. And, certainly in that comparison, the key factor is their abrasive public personas that elicit lots of hatred. You could say, genuinely, if you're hating an Onision novel, a big part of that is hatred of his public persona. Can you say this is bad because the person who wrote it is a really horrible person and is publicly abrasive? That's the sort of thing you would do with like Hemingway, and that's the sort of thing you would do with Jonathan Franzen. But then you can look at Kanye's work, and he's publicly very abrasive and combative and complicated in the public. But can you say that persona is harmful to his work? I would say, with an example like Runaway, that enhances his work. So it's hard to say just being a publicly abrasive, horribly, that's the wrong word for it, but a great heel, but an effective provocateur might be the way to say it. Onision, genuinely bad. Kanye, abrasive persona and provocateur. Can you say that actually genuinely negatively affects his work? No, not really. So it's hard to really say that that's an actual universal. But anyway, that's my episode where I pretend to be an authority on hip-hop. Not at all. But an interesting comparison that's possible for if somebody else who's much more of an expert wants to take that up. Feel free. See you on the next episode.